Professor Bill Bowring, thank you very much for joining us today. I want to start by asking, actually getting your reaction against Turkish invasion in northern Syria as a legal expert.
So it's completely illegal, and Turkey, it is an invasion. And of course, we first had this in January of 2018 with Afrin. Of course, the Russians let the Turkish forces in because the Russians had troops there and were providing air cover. And there was an agreement then, at the beginning of 2018, between Turkey and Russia. And now, this time, it was an invasion by Turkey because Trump ordered the removal of the American troops who were giving protection to the Kurdish forces. So quite clearly, then Turkey immediately invaded. Then Trump said that was not what he had intended, and there would be sanctions against Turkey, but nonetheless, Turkey is there. And then the Kurds, of course, had an agreement with, they had no choice, with Assad to come in and protect them. But of course, Assad doesn't do anything without the support of the Russians. So that was the reason why there was the meeting for 6 hours between Putin and Erdogan. And basically, the Kurds have been completely betrayed by the United States. But in any event, you see, the Russians are there legally because they were invited by the government of Syria. Turkey is not there legally. They're simply in a use of armed force.
And what does international law says about it? Is it just in every state can do just whenever they want, they can get into another state and just occupy and do whatever they want? So where does international law stand in here?
Right. So before the Second World War, there was international law, but states could do exactly what they wanted. And so when Britain, France, Germany, and so on carved up Africa at the end of the 19th century, there was nothing to say that they couldn't do that. And for example, when after the First World War, first of all, the Kurds were promised a homeland, and then they didn't get it. And as you know, there was a war between Turkey and Greece, and all the Greeks got thrown out of Turkey. And there was also the genocide of the Armenians at the same time. And at that time, there was no international law saying they couldn't do that. So there is a difference, which is that since the Second World War, we have the United Nations, and the Charter of the United Nations makes it very clear that states cannot use force. They can only use force with the approval of the Security Council or in self-defense. So that is now very, very clear. And so states do break it. For example, Britain and America violated international law when they invaded and occupied Iraq. Russia has violated international law when it annexed Crimea and gave support to the separatists in Donbass. And so big states do violate the law. But then if you look at anyone who tells me there is no criminal law in England, is there criminal law in England? I think there is. But if you're rich and powerful, it doesn't apply to you, of course, and you get away with it in almost all cases. So there is criminal law in England, but it only applies to poor people, and black people in particular.
So in this case, the Kurds are the black...
No. So what I'm saying is, there is international law. 95% of the time it is obeyed. States don't like being told that they're violating international law. So even Britain and America put a lot of effort into trying to persuade everyone else that they're obeying international law. I've just written a chapter on Russia's annexation of Crimea and the legal explanations which a whole lot of Russian professors give as to why it was legal for them to annex Crimea. So international law is there. But Turkey at the moment, I think, is putting itself in a very interesting position, because it's a member of NATO, supposedly, and quite an important one. At the same time, it's doing deals with Russia in order to take illegal armed action against Syria. So one of the things that's happened in Syria is that America has lost, and it's the biggest defeat for the United States since Vietnam. Russia has won. So that is what is going on. And who is suffering? Well, the Kurds are suffering.
Yeah. The big powers.
Yeah. So, I mean, the big powers don't like being told that they're breaking international. So there is international law. Question, what can you do about it? Well, the United Nations doesn't have an army. And because of the way the United Nations was set up after the Second World War, there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council out of 15 who are the winners in the Second World War. So Britain, France, the United States, Russia and China. And they all have a veto. So when the Security Council tries to take action, they're blocked. If it's a question of Israel, it's the United States which uses the veto. If it's a question of action by Russia or, let's say, Turkey and Russia, then Russia exercises the veto in the Security Council.
Then it is blocked.
So, and the people who are really suffering are the Kurds. So, as we were discussing before, the Kurds, individual Kurds, are represented Özgür Gündem, or organisation of Kurds, can go to the Human Rights Court, and Abdullah Öcalan would not be alive today, but for the European Court of Human Rights. And Turkey was going to execute him, and then the court said, no, you can't. So he's still alive on Emirati Island. He would be dead now if it wasn't for the European Court of Human Rights. So, you know, it has some effect.
So what can be done in according to international law against these all war crimes and human rights violations?
Well, so there is the International Criminal Court now. And so the International Criminal Court is investigating war crimes committed by Britain in Iraq. It's investigating war crimes committed by Russia in Georgia and in Ukraine. It's investigating war crimes committed by Israel in Gaza. And the thing with what's happening at the present time in Syria is that according to the statute of the International Criminal Court, either you can prosecute people who are citizens of a state which has ratified the statute of the International Criminal Court, or you can prosecute war crimes committed by people who commit them on the territory of a state which has recognized it. So Georgia has recognized it, so you can prosecute the Russians who commit war crimes in Georgia. Ukraine has ratified it, so you can prosecute Russians who commit war crimes in Ukraine. Palestine has ratified it, so you can prosecute Israelis who commit. With Syria, the problem is that the states which are committing war crimes at the present moment in time, you don't have either of those conditions. And it would be, I mean, so there's no question but war crimes have been committed. The question is, how could you prosecute people as a result of those war crimes? And again, I think, you know, I personally think this is a tragedy of the Kurds.
There is not even any investigation like all we are talking about, these all war crimes. There is not even one investigation has started about these claims, even OPCV, because of that white phosphorus used in Syria.
So I think all we can do is do our own investigation as best we can, and to make it public. I think if you didn't have that, it would be really terrible. But at least, and there are wonderful, wonderful people in Turkey, human rights people, and the people who work on torture, and the medical people, doing investigations all the time. And there are similar people in Syria, and similar people in Russia. So I think all of us have a duty to do what we can. And I think the more that these facts come out, even if it's not an official investigation, the more chance there is of influencing public opinion.
Lastly, how do you see the future of Syria or future of the Kurds in Syria?
I wish I could say, wouldn't it be good if I had a... So I think the Kurds are not going away, number one. I think the Kurds are also very tough people. I think the problem for the Kurds in Syria is that they don't have an air force, you know, and they were dependent on the Americans previously, or the Russians in Afrin. But the Kurds are, I mean, they're exceptionally tough people, and they have a long history of resistance. So I think, you know, it's like with the Palestinians, for example. I think eventually, of course, there will have to be different kinds of settlement. At the moment, what you have is a big conflict between Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, against the United States. And at the moment, Turkey has lined up with Russia. So I'm not sure how good this is going to be for Turkey. You know, and NATO's gone. So it was, I think it was really important for the Turkish regime that they were part of NATO. Yeah.
Professor Bill Bowring, thank you very much for joining us today.